Our authors today are Barbara Nickless, Peg Brantley, and Liz Coulter. And you have very nice bios for each of the authors in your brochure, so I'm not going to read those for you. But I'd like for each author to take a minute or so to introduce themselves and tell us something that may not be in your bio, which would be kind of fun. And we'll start with Barbara.
So I'm Barbara Nickless. I write the Sidney Parnell mystery thriller novels. It's about a former Marine turned railroad cop and her canine partner. The third book just came out. I'm working on the fourth book. And I don't remember what's in my bio. So I guess I'll just say the first book I wrote was when I was 9. Do you guys remember the days when Scholastic, you would get that catalog and you could order these books and they would bring them and it was like Christmas? And one of the books I got was Harriet Tubman, a book about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. So I thought, I'm going to write a book that deals with this huge issue and race in America and slavery, and it's going to be amazing. And so I started writing it and realized within the first page that I had no idea about race in America and slavery and this whole issue. So my heroine on the first page, she falls off the horse and she dies. And I changed the title from Road to Freedom to Trampled by a Horse.
Because you knew about that.
It was easier to imagine.
I'm Peg Brantley. Can you hear? I have a couple of different series. They're based in Colorado. I have a fictional town called Aspen Falls, and it is between Snowmass and Aspen. I conveniently kicked out all the ranchers that are there and plopped down a little college town, very much like Boulder, right there. So it's there's some local things in my books that I have fun researching, and I get to go to Aspen a lot, which is also good.
Hi, I'm Liz Coulter. I write contemporary fantasy as L.D. Coulter and epic fantasy as L. Denny Coulter. I crammed quite a few of my odd jobs into my bio there. I'm trying to think of one that isn't in there. I was an athletic trainer for a while, and one of my less desirable jobs was doing the laundry for the men's basketball team when I was an intern. Yes, going in. Yes, thank you for the sympathy.
Not.
Yeah, no, not. But yes, one of the many jobs I held over many years of odd jobs.
Thank you. We'll start. Peg, you get the first question here.
Oh, my.
I know. So how did you come to write in your genre and your book award book in particular? And we'll go through each of you, but we'll start with you, Peg.
Okay. I remember a long time ago, I was about to enter a contest for writers, and I had written I don't know if you guys are familiar with the women's fiction genre. And I was getting ready to send it in, and my stomach was upset, and I couldn't sleep. And I finally realized I was afraid I might win, and then I'd have to write women's fiction forever. And what I really love to read is suspense and crime fiction and thrillers. So I pulled that book and I rewrote it, changed the characters' names, changed what they did for a living. I think he went from an accountant to a detective. And that's how I started writing in the genre that I write now, which is suspense and thrillers. You wanted to know about the book that won the award? I had a list. My books have some social issues in the background with all of them. And this one, I had a list of about 6 or 7 things that kind of interested me, and I kept going back to human trafficking. So that's why I wrote Trafficked. And a friend of mine told me, Peg, if you write this book, I was just noodling with the idea. She said, Peg, if you write this book, promise me you will make it about here and not over there. So that's what I did.
Thank you. Liz?
Well, my route into writing speculative fiction is probably like 95% of other people. I read Tolkien when I was 10. I read The Hobbit, and that changed me forever. I've read speculative fiction ever since. Dived straight from that into the Lord of the Rings trilogy and never looked back. For my novel A Borrowed Hell, which was the Colorado Book Award winner, I had read epic fantasy and secondary world fantasy for decades, and quite suddenly discovered a lot of new-to-me writers writing contemporary fantasy. And I loved it. And I decided, I'd already written my epic fantasy and decided to write a contemporary fantasy book. And so I used the same heroic themes, person facing insurmountable odds, and put it in a contemporary setting about a man who has to confront his past in order to move forward in life. And that confrontation takes place in a fantasy venue. So.
Thank you. Barb.
And my mom was an English teacher, so I grew up in a house filled with books, and we had one room where there were floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and every kind of book imaginable in there. And my mom had me read all the classics when I was really young, and she got me the, do you guys remember the Junior Classics illustrated comic books? Is anybody? Yes. It's like, I wrote my AP exam on a comic book. But my mom's secret love was mysteries. And she read everything from John le Carré to, who's the author who writes the talking cat books, or where the cat solves the mystery? Lillian? Yes, Lillian Jackson Brown. Is it Brown? Braun. Okay. And so she called it her popcorn reading. It was her guilty pleasure, and I thought, well, gosh, that sounds like way more fun than Tess of the D'Urbervilles. And Sherlock Holmes was one of the first authors that I read, and I loved that mix of the mystery and excitement of not knowing who did something, but also being able to fix it and use your logic and your mind, and I loved all the science of it. So police procedurals just felt like a natural way to go. Oh, and so my first two books, I was really fortunate. Blood on the Tracks and Dead Stop both won the Colorado Book Award. And in those books, I deal with veterans' issues. I come from a military family. I learned very young that veterans don't like to talk about what happened to them. And of course, this was in the middle of the Iraq War, when a lot of veterans were coming back and struggling to fit back into our society, which is something very difficult to do. And so that's what I was tackling in those first two books.
Super. Thank you so much. This question is for all three of you. We'll start with Liz. And do you develop the plot first or the characters? What speaks to you? And do you have particular themes that you were drawn to in your writing?
I definitely do not come up with the plot first. There are plotters or outliners, and there are pantsers, writing by the seat of your pants. I am 100% pantser for all of my books. But I do have a method, and characters tend to come to me first, a character and a tone for the book, how dark it will be, if it will be more adventure, whatever. And then next comes a setting, and then I get the beginning and the end, an idea of the end, where the book will finish up. And everything in between is a big mystery. And once I have the beginning, the character, the setting, usually an opening scene comes to me, I start writing, and I figure out the rest as I go. Oh, and there was a part two to that, wasn't it?
Yes. Do you
themes.
use a theme? Yeah.
Themes, well, I think I touched on it in the previous question. Heroic themes are pretty much every story ever written. You know, the hero facing insurmountable odds, starting with the Odyssey. But I'm very drawn to those kind of characters, the struggling, tortured hero, and what makes up their character and what makes up their obstacles and how they overcome. So that's a common theme.
Thank you. Barbara?
Yeah, that whole plotting versus pantsing thing, I still haven't figured that out. I kind of call myself a plantser because
Yeah.
I can't fully commit to either one. I feel like if I had a plot, I would be able to write a lot faster, and this whole deadline thing would be less stressful. I have not succeeded in that. So I come up with a concept and then create the characters to kind of go with that, and then go back to the plot. So, they always said, well, is your book character-driven or is it plot-driven? And it's like, well, yeah. So I have no words of wisdom on that. As far as themes, I think there are the themes that we consciously choose, which for me was the whole deal about coming home from war and trying to fit in or trying to help your family member fit in. And then there's the unconscious themes that keep popping up in our stories that we're not really aware of until somebody points them out. And I thought it was interesting. I made my detective, Sydney Parnell, is an orphan. Essentially, her father disappeared. Her mother was arrested for murdering a man and sent to jail, and she died in prison. And I find that theme, those relationships between children and parents, keep coming up. And I have no idea what my parents would make of this. They are not here with us anymore. But it's obviously something I'm still trying to explore, and that's one of the beauties of writing, is getting to look at that stuff that's floating around in our subconscious. And the other thing, a theme that keeps coming up in mine is sort of this urban, rural environment. And a reader pointed out that apparently I start my stories in the city, in the gritty city, and then when it comes time to duke it out with the bad guy, we go out into the wilderness and battle it out there. So I'm not quite sure what that says.
Characters come to me first, and I you hear character-driven stories, but they're the first ones that sort of start to just yammer away in my head. And then I have to figure out something for them to do that's interesting. And so that goes right to plot and to theme. I really do, and I touched on this in the last question, social issues are important to me. And whatever is currently people are talking about or not talking about that they should be talking about, I put those stories right in front of my characters and make them have to deal with it. So I would just want to keep them interesting. But it's for me, it starts with characters. And I'm a lot like Barbara. I have a scene list, but it's not an outline. And I move them around like crazy, and I eliminate them, and I think, oh my gosh, I got to write about this here, and it needs to go there. But that's as I'm writing the story. So it's not all detailed initially. I think I'd get bored with it way faster than I get bored with it anyway.
Thank you. This next question is for Barbara and Peg, and you can do rock, paper, scissors, or tag team it. Would you talk, please, about the difference between the different genres that we call mystery? Thriller, suspense, cop procedurals. Those all say mystery to me, but I know that that's not right. Could you give us a little elucidation there?
Crime fiction.
Crime fiction, yeah.
Okay.
That's a good umbrella. And what would you consider your books, Peggy?
Well, I sort of consider them suspense. And I was talking to somebody earlier, because other writers had referred to them as thrillers. And I asked him, an author one time, what the difference was between a suspense and a thriller. And he said the amount of the advance. So, there.
And it's thriller. You want to call them thriller,
Yes,
right?
yes. I write thrillers.
I think, people ask that question a lot, like what's the difference between a mystery and a thriller besides the advance?
I know that one. You know that one. You answered that one. That's an easy one.
Is it? Oh, that's easy. Oh, no pressure.
You go, girl.
I think a mystery is like a whodunit, or even a better way to think of it is a whydunit. Why did, not only who committed this crime, but why? But it's a puzzle, and you have to play fair with the reader. So there has to be enough clues that in theory, they can figure it out. And with thriller, so it's kind of like who did this and why? And then with thriller, it's oh my God, what's going to happen? Because we're often in the viewpoint of the villain. So, there's a great example that Hitchcock said, the difference between surprise and suspense. So if you have two characters sitting at a table talking, and all of a sudden the table blows up and they die, that's a surprise. If you take those two characters and you put them at a table, and you show the audience that there's a bomb under the table, that's suspense.
Super.
Yeah, with a suspense or a thriller, you often know who did it in the beginning. With a mystery, it's all a mystery.
And do you think suspense is more, like we think about psychological suspense, so is it, like the books I've read have been more atmospheric?
It's a time bomb. It's a roller coaster thing, and you know something's going to happen bad. Are they going to be able to pull it off or not? Well, they always pull it off. In my books, they always pull it off. The other thing is I never kill an animal. No dogs die in my books, but I kill people.
Hey, no dogs die. Oh, wait. Only the bad dogs.
Only the bad dogs die. Okay. So we got a little off topic there.
Didn't know there were any bad dogs. Okay, so Liz, this next question's for you. It's concerning science fiction and fantasy, and I was a big fan of both in my younger days. We often see them in the same section in bookstores. They kind of congregate together. Do they share an audience? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think for many people they do. Probably not all, but like you, I grew up reading both. I tend to read a lot of fantasy and watch a lot of science fiction. But I think, yeah, I know. I think it had to do with CIG and
Yes.
how that came along. Yeah, I think a lot of people enjoy both. And if you enjoy speculative fiction to begin with, I think you like pushing those boundaries of what ifs. So, but a lot of writers write both, so having all of their books in one section. In fact, last year's guest of honor was Kevin Anderson, I believe, and he writes everything from epic fantasy to Star Wars tie-in. And then some books are just slipstream, which means they're a genre bending or blending. I'm reading N.K. Jemison's, the third book in her Shattered Earth series, which for those of you who aren't speculative fiction readers, has won 3 Hugos. All 3 books have won a Hugo. And it's science fantasy. It's a blend of both. There's magic and science, and certainly not the only book out there like that.
Octavia Butler, you read Octavia
Octavia
Butler?
Butler?
She's like a favorite. Yeah, I love her.
And she writes both.
Yeah,
Or
wrote both. Yeah.
wrote both.
Yeah.
So don't they say that one man's magic is another man's science? Is that?
Yeah. Or what is it? Magic is science we don't understand yet. So.
Thank you. We're going to start with Peg for this one. Then all of you get a chance. I know. I thought I'd just warn you.
Okay, okay.
And it kind of bounces off. We were just talking about thrillers and suspense. Do you know your antagonist at the beginning of the story, or is it something that's a process of discovery?
Since I know my characters really well, usually before I start to write the story, I do know my antagonist. Do I know everything about that person? No. So I do discover things about that person as I write. Maybe they love cats, or they.
As all evil villains do.
Or they call their mother every afternoon at 3:30. There's some things that will show up, and yes, he's an evil, antagonistic person, but there's kind of a soft side to him too. But that shows up as I write the story.
Thank you.
And I think for me, it's, for the first 2 books, I knew who my killer was. And then every time that person showed up in the book or I mentioned that person's name, it felt like there was a neon sign going off, killer, killer, killer. And you want to play fair with the reader. You don't want to hand it to them. And so I changed my mind multiple times while I was writing, just figuring if I didn't know, then the reader's not going to know. And I ended up going with my original villain. Then in the third book, I knew what my bad guy had done, but I didn't know who he was or why he'd done it. So that was kind of frantic. But I think that, one of my favorite stories with that is, speaking of J.R.R. Tolkien, when Strider shows up, this is going to be a spoiler, is that okay? When Strider shows up, the first time when the hobbits have fled, and he shows up in that tavern, Tolkien had no idea that Strider was Aragorn, son of Arathorn, the king. So I thought, just sometimes have characters show up and see what they do.
Liz, how about you?
I like Barbara, I often think that I know who it is, but I have been surprised in my first myth-based book, While Gods Sleep. I started out knowing who my antagonist was, built a second antagonist, and it's like, yes, I've got my bad guys, and then a supervillain appeared on the scene and just stole the book.
Took it over.
Halfway through the book, and I was like, oh my gosh, there they are. That's that.
Serendipity.
And it dovetailed in. Yeah, it doesn't come out as choppy as this probably makes it sound like. It was obvious. They sometimes write their own stories.
Yeah, that's kind of the gift of not plotting, isn't it? Stuff really does show up.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll start with Liz on this question. What was your experience in finding an agent and/or a publisher?
I still query my new books to agents and publishers, but I have 2 books out, one through a small press, one through a medium press, and both of those publishers, we kind of found each other through my short story writing. So networking and short story writing definitely helped me there. One of the publishers had bought 5 of my short stories, and another one was a judge for an international contest Kevin Anderson again. And so that's how I found those publishers.
Thank you. Barbara?
When I wrote Blood on the Tracks, it was right after my house had burned down in the Waldo Canyon fire, and I poured heart and soul into it, but I kind of knew I'd been writing for a long time. I had 2 other novels. This was kind of my do or die moment. And so my husband and I agreed we would come up with the money to go to Thriller Fest in New York City, which is every July, and there's something there called Pitch Fest, which is exactly like those really horrible dating games where you have 3 minutes to prove yourself and then you get sent to the next guy. So we lined up, there were a couple hundred of us, we line up outside the doors, and then they open the doors and we run in, and we've plotted our strategy, which agents do we want to pitch to and who's going to have the longest line, and I can pitch to these lower agents because there's not as many people there, and 3.5 hours,
Whoa.
9 pitches, so you can imagine what the lines were like. And I walked out of there and I was exhausted, and I had a couple hours before the cocktail party that night, and so I was going to go up and do a face plant in my hotel room. And I'm standing at the elevator, and Hank Philippi Ryan, if any of you know her, she's one of the most fantastic people around, big heart. She's standing there, and I go up and talk to her, and she doesn't know me from Adams, but that's okay. And then this man walks up, and he knows Hank, and so Hank goes, oh, agent, author, agent. And he turned to me, and he said, oh, you've written a book? I said, yeah. He said, well, tell me about it. And I said, I'm too tired. And fortunately, he didn't listen to me, and he pulled me off, and I pitched the book, and he said, well, send it to me. And I said, well, it's not quite done. It's 2/3 done. That's okay, just send it to me. So I go up to my hotel room, and I don't do a face plant. I send him the book, and then I start looking him up to see, who is this guy, and is he really a good agent? And yeah, he was a really big agent. And I sent him my book, and he sat in the hotel lobby, and he started reading it, and he offered me representation before the cocktail party that night.
Wow.
And you know what my answer was? Well, how far have you read? He goes, oh, I'm on page 30 or whatever. I said, it gets worse. And so the rest of the weekend, he wined me and he dined me. I mean, it was a dream come true, but he would text me, he'd say, okay, chapter 8, the offer still stands. And I'd text back, kind of fails after that. So it really was a dream come true. And if you are writing in that genre, I would say think about Pitch Fest, because it's pretty amazing to have that opportunity.
I'm going to have to go. That sounds great. I self-publish, so I do it all. I don't have to worry about agents and publishers, although I would like to be hybrid. I'm not. And so, but I do it right. I have a cover designer. I don't do my own covers. I have editors. I pay them dearly to edit my book. And I buy my own ISBNs, so they're not, I'm not using somebody else's. And I do watercolors, so I painted the logo for my thing. He's a little schnauzer, and it's called Bark Publishing.
Oh, and I have so much admiration, because I don't think I could, that's such a skill set.
I got tired of rejection, you know? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We'll start with Barb this time. And go boom, boom, boom. Are you a full-time writer? And if you are, what are the pros and cons?
I am a full-time writer, and the pros are you never have to get out of your sweatpants. Gosh, when I still had a cat, I could keep my cat company, which was very important to my cat. And it's, I get to play with these imaginary people all day. I would have to say the cons really surprised me. Because once your book goes out there, it doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the world. And sometimes you kind of feel like a piñata. And you have no control over how people will respond to your book. It is what it is, and you have to move on to the next one.
Standing on a street corner naked.
Yeah, with a big sign that says, beat me with a stick. So the reviews thing was, that was hard for me, because I'm a natural people pleaser. And I think the other con was having a deadline, which is great because it forces you to keep working, but it's also absolutely terrifying because if the book's not going well or a family member gets sick or something happens, your deadline is your deadline is your deadline. And I found, real quick, I found the fun kind of leaching out because I was looking at those reviews and I was terrified of that deadline. And I am now in the process of remembering what a joy it is. And there's to get to write. And there's a wonderful Elizabeth Gilbert TED Talk. It's like 10 or 12 minutes where she talks about how important it is that we find what matters to our heart. And she says whether it's raising corgis in the countryside or writing a novel or whatever it is, just remember to come back to that and quit worrying about what she calls the random hurricanes of outcome.
Also known as unintended consequences. Yes. Am I next?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Pros. It is really, there is a joy to, I do write full-time. There's a joy to being able to do that. And it's almost addictive. Some days you have to force yourself. It's called bit shock, which sounds sort of like a cuss word, but it stands for butt in chair, hands on keys. And you have to force yourself to write and to show up. And you might write drivel, but you have to write. Other days, and this is where it gets addictive, it just flows and the time is gone. And the words they didn't come, I know they didn't come from me. They had to come from somebody else because I'm not that good. And so that's one of the pros of being able to do that and hanging out with characters that you grow to love all day long.
And characters on the stage.
And characters on the stage. Cons. And also I have to dress up to go to Walmart. So being able to just, sit there and be terrible all day long is kind of a nice thing. Con is marketing, for me, is not a fun thing to do. We were talking about hawking our books, and that's not a fun thing to do. But you learn how to do it. It's one of the things you have to suck up and do. What else is a con about working full? Oh, it's 7 days a week. When you're a full-time writer and you're working at home, it's hard to take time off, and it's hard to stop and go and balance your family life with your work life when you're working at home.
Thank you. Liz?
I am also a barefoot full-time writer. I have not always been. I started writing nearly 20 years ago and wrote for many, many years while working full-time jobs or seasonal jobs is where I really got into the flow of writing novels. Right now, my very elderly mother lives with us, moved in with my husband and I, and so I need to be home, but she's still very independent, so it's been a win-win situation. Pros and cons, I would say both the pro and the con is the time that I have. I have the time to sit and write and to do the business stuff and to do the networking stuff, and the business end of it is huge.
It's surprising.
50% of my time. But I also have enough time that there's always tomorrow. I only got to here, so, well, there's tomorrow. And I think I write a little slower now than I did when I had a full-time job and I had 2 days a week or 3 days a week and I had to get it done. And I would like to be writing faster, not slower, so that's something I'm working on.
Thank you. We'll start with Peg. Okay, it's not a hard one. Okay.
What is the wind speed velocity of a European swallow?
I can see your face from here. So. Okay. Do you have a critique group, and how does that affect your work?
When I first started writing, I was involved in a critique group, and it was amazing. And it was sort of like a God-given blessing to have this critique group. One of them, there were 3 of us initially. One of them was a journalist in San Antonio. Then there was me, who'd never written anything. And then there was an editor from Canada that was writing a book. And so I was blessed with these 2 amazing women that could help me try to figure some things out. So that was my original critique group. Now I have beta readers, and I will send out a manuscript that I have polished as much as I could do it independently, edited as much as I could do it myself, and then I'll send it out to beta readers to give me feedback. And that's kind of like a critique group.
Yeah. Thank you. Liz?
Yes, I think over the 20 years I've been a writer, I've almost always had a critique group, either an in-person one or online critique partners. I think it's a really important part of writing. I know people who write in a vacuum and send it out, but I think it's really essential because it's kind of a forest in the trees situation. You're so close to your work that you can't really see how other people are going to see it. And getting that objective feedback on what works, what doesn't, did the information come out in the right order, things that are crystal clear to me because I'm writing the book are totally not to other people.
Right.
So I think they're very valuable, and I have usually sought out people who are not family, not best friends,
Right.
don't recommend that, but peers who are writing at or hopefully above the level that I'm at, because I learn so much from the
Can I add
critiques
one
I
thing?
get.
I want to add just one thing, really. One of the dangers of critique groups is doing everything they tell you to do, because then you're writing by committee, and your work begins to stink.
Yeah, no, that's
Stink.
a
good
good
word.
point. It's your book and your vision, and you need to, it's an art to learn what criticism
It
to
is an
take and
art,
what not
yeah.
to.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I have to say, for me, my books would not exist without my critique group. I am so fortunate to be in a group with the people I am, and also my beta readers. And I guess my recommendation is, I was in a group years ago where the group was there were people in the group for whom the important thing was their ego as a critiquer. They were not there to help the rest of us get better. Their hearts were not in the right place. There were some who would tear you down no matter what. And, you know, you'd walk away feeling like you'd been run over by a Mack truck. But like the group I'm in now, I know that everybody in that group, all they want is to help me make my work better. And that's how I feel about them. So that's really important, that level of trust. And I also remember the first time I was able to put my ego aside enough to go in and hear the criticism. And I was only there to make my work better. This wasn't about me, it was about the work. And I mean, I know that sounds so simple, but it was eye-opening when I could separate myself from my work and just focus on that.
You grew as a writer. Score.
Yeah,
Score. Okay, we're going to start with Liz on this one. It's a two-part question. So pay attention.
Peg.
So
Is there going to be like a Jeopardy thing after this?
So what was your reaction when you learned you'd won the Colorado Book Award? And did your writing life change after that?
My reaction was I was quite stunned, actually. I mean, you go there hoping that you'll win, but one of the books that I was up against had been published through Tor, which is one of the biggest speculative fiction publishers around, my little small press book. So I think what the book award gave to me was validation. It was an extremely validating moment to have a panel of judges read my book and find it worthy of winning. And writing is such a solitary experience, and then you battle trying to get sales and get good reviews and this and that. And to have judges objectively look at your book and say, yeah, we chose this as the winner, was very validating.
And how did it change?
How did
it change your, what was the second part?
Was it life-changing, or did it change how you write, or did it change how you felt about your writing, or how other people
well,
looked at you?
I think just the validation was motivation, that yes, you're on the right path, yes, you can do this, you can succeed at it if you keep working at it. So,
Thank you.
yeah. Thanks.
Barbara?
Yeah, I agree with what Liz has said here. You know, we work so much in isolation, and we have nobody's voice but our own, except when we're in a critique meeting, to tell us whether we're doing the right thing or the wrong thing in terms of writing a book that will appeal to people. And as soon as my first book went out, I was like, wait, I changed my mind. Do-overs. Can I pull this back? And so getting that call or that email about the Colorado Book Award was, it was really huge for me. And the first thing I did was I told my mom, who's not been here for 12 years, but I knew she'd be really excited for me. And then I got back to work.
Trafficked had won an earlier award, like yours had as well. And I decided, so I had submitted it to two groups. One was the Colorado Authors League, and then the Humanities. The Colorado Authors League, I won, or Trafficked won. I didn't win, the book won. And I thought, okay, I've got one. I'm not going to get a second one. I was really proud to be a finalist for the Colorado Book Awards, and we went to the wonderful place and sat, and I just knew I wasn't going to get two. So my reaction was complete shock when it was announced that Trafficked was the winner. it is complete validation, but it also, because my name was out there, it's opened up book clubs for me to attend. It's speaking engagements. I've been on panels not only about writing, but about human trafficking. And so it really, because I won something, the book won something, I'm a lot more active in making presentations.
Thank you. Barb, you get to start off this one. You ready?
Right.
Okay.
Bring it on.
When you're writing or thinking about writing, are you just writing to get published, or are you striving to write as a career?
That is exactly the mindset that I'm trying to balance. So part of that is you have to put aside all of that thought about getting published or how the book will be received, and just focus on the pleasure of doing the work. And I think Stephen King said, you write with the door closed, meaning it's just you and your story, and then you revise with the door open. That's when you allow in the critique group and the editors. I do feel like at this point that I have a quasi-career. I mean, in this publishing business, everything could tank tomorrow. That's how it goes. But I am mindful of, I was talking with the author, Holly. Where are you, Holly? About this earlier today, that once you kind of get established in a genre, that's where you're expected to stay. And once I turn in the 4th book of my mystery thriller series, the publishers asked for a standalone, and I want to do something wildly different. And I don't know if I'll get to do that. It'll be interesting. So it does suddenly become a career, and you don't totally own it yourself anymore.
Thank you. Peg.
Am I writing to write the story or to be published? Is that the question?
Are you writing to get published, or are you trying to make a career out of it?
Definitely career, because it's something I enjoy. It's where my heart is. The idea of getting stuck in a genre it happens to a lot of, I know some best-selling authors who are expected to produce a book in their series every single year, and the author is sick to death of the series. And it's really hard to break out and do something else. So that is working to be published and expectations of the publisher. I fortunately, because I self-publish, don't have to do that. So if I want to do something different, I can. In fact, I've got this fantasy that's been going around in my head for years, and one of these days I'm going to write it. But right now I'm writing thrillers.
Thank you. Liz?
I think I've always hoped for this to turn into, to be a career, hopefully a self-supporting career at some point. I've always worked toward that. I'm not there, but I think I'm headed in the right direction. I have worked at writing longer than any other job in my life. I think my record was 7 years at one job before this, and but writing, I can definitely do this for the rest of my life.
Thank you. We're at the 15-minute mark, so if any of you have questions for the panelists, if you'd write them down on your cards, and while you do that, one of our staff members will come around and pick them up and bring them to me. So one last question for the panel while they do that. And we'll start with Peg.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm ready. Finally, go ahead.
Is writing in the writing life harder than you thought it would be?
Oh, yeah. Is writing life harder than I thought it would be? Yes. First of all, I was a voracious reader. I read all the time. I thought, how hard could it be to write a book? And then I decided to do that. And it took me years to get something that was worthy of somebody else reading. So yeah, it was a whole lot harder than I thought it would be.
Yes. When I first started out, you have sort of the golden egg vision of what it'll be like, but as I learned the business of writing, took off the rosy-colored glasses. So it hasn't been a big shock. But yes, writing itself is harder than one would think, at least when you're writing for other people rather than for yourself. But I'm continuing to learn how hard writing is. I had the good fortune to go to Taos Toolbox last year, which is a sort of a master seminar for speculative fiction writers. And it is run by two well-known writers, and then we have guest authors, and one of them was George R.R. Martin. And so I got to spend an evening with George, which was really cool. And he, like the other two people running the seminar, talked about his career path and the peaks and valleys, and even after major successes in the business, all of them had tanked for a few years at a time, and then written another thing that was really popular, and then tanked for a while. So yes, sorry, sorry, but yeah, it's writing. Writing is a hard business, and it's a job like any other.
So now I have to share my George R.R. Martin story because it ties in with that. I got to meet him at Thriller Fest, and I'm shaking his hand, and I'm like, Mr. Martin, I have to tell you, I loved your books long before Game of Thrones. And he looks at me, and I said, oh yes, Fever Dream and The Armageddon Rag. And he looks at me and he says, so you were one of the 17 people who bought that book. But yeah, no, I mean, what's that saying? Writing is easy. You just sit down and open a vein.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we have some questions from the audience. Thank you so much for taking some time to write your thoughts down. I don't know who wants to, you all can do rock, paper, scissors for these. Do you write one book at a time, or do you have more than one going at the same time? Like, is there one in edits and one being written and one in research? How do any of you handle that? Thank you.
I write one novel at a time. I'm also ghostwriting an autobiography, so those are happening at the same time, but they're different enough that I can keep them separate.
I primarily write one book at a time. I wouldn't feel comfortable creating more than one at a time, but I might be revising one or have a deadline on something or an expectation from somebody else for kind of a side project or a short story or something. But as far as creating a novel, one at a time.
And my goal is to write more than one book at a time, or at least to be writing one and researching the next. And I have not succeeded in that.
Thank you. Do you have books that were not published that you changed your mind about or hope to revise and publish in the future? Mine are under the bed gathering dust. But
Oh, yeah.
That would be true. I think it's like when I read a book that I really love, it's hard for me to read it a second time because I'm afraid I won't love it as much. And so with the stories that I've written that are in the drawer, I'm tempted to think I want to go back and look at them, but I'm probably not.
Whoever wrote the question, I would say don't give up on those books under the bed. They may not be ready, they may not be publishable, and you move on and you write other stuff and you keep learning to write better. But I have gone back to things and rewritten them and brought them up to my current writing abilities. And The Half-Blood War was a labor of love for me. That one was my first novel that I wrote and didn't get published, and I shelved it and I wrote other books. And is it worth the time investment or not? It may or it may not be, but I went back to that book and rewrote it up to my current abilities, and it got published. And I was really happy about that.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
Because I think most writers have those, I call them trunk books.
Yeah, and there are.
Under the bed books. But yeah, I've got a couple of those I think that I probably will go back to. But somebody said you have to write 1 million words before you get to be any good. So I think we all should have trunk books.
Yeah, some books should be trunked. Some of my writing needed to go in the
I
trunk.
don't know,
and
I'm going to
stay
pull
there.
out Trampled by a Horse and give that another try.
I like that one. It's got some grit to it.
Yeah.
It's heart.
It's real.
Okay, after you were published for the first time, how did your writing life change, and how did you adapt your process to accommodate? Take a minute.
My process has changed with every book I've written. It's not, and I think it's evolving as my writing evolves. So I don't have one set of expectations that I have to go back to every time. Hopefully, that process is getting better.
I was first published in short stories, so it's a little bit different path, maybe. And I began with small magazines, low-paying magazines, and sort of worked up to pro publications. I would say the change for me came when I won Writers of the Future, which is it's an amateur.
It's huge.
Big, really big short story writing contest. And yeah, it really is huge. It's like a week in Hollywood and a enormous gala award thing. And that changed my perspective about writing and upped my game and networked with people. So yeah, that's when it changed.
Yeah, and I don't think my method changed because it's always been a word count. I have a word count, and it doesn't matter where you are in your publishing career. It's like Peg was saying, it's butt in chair. And this morning I was at my computer at 6 a.m. because I didn't get my word count done this week. I had 639 words to go before I could do anything else.
Thank you. Peg, this one's specifically for you. The question, and I think it is, how did you pick the self-publishing option that you did out of the different things that you had to choose from?
Okay.
And did you invest in a marketing plan from the start?
Okay. A mentor of mine who writes some really good books, police procedurals, L.J. Sellers, she and I were sharing a room at a book thing one time, and I was not published at the time. I hadn't self-published. And she had gone from having a publisher to self-publishing. She got her rights back on her books and self-published. And she convinced me that I needed to take the step to be vulnerable and get my book out there. And so I did. And I followed her guidelines in terms of doing everything as professionally as I could, becoming a publisher and doing everything that a publisher would do for me. And that includes marketing. And you have to be willing to invest in that book because nobody knew, and very little people know now, but nobody knew then who Peg Brantley was. And were her books worth, the time for you to read, not just to buy, but to also read. So you have to sort of let people know, and you have to invest to do that. Even traditionally published authors have to have a marketing plan and have to invest in their books. And that's time going to events, paying for ads, doing things like that.
So did you hire a marketing person?
I have not hired a publicist, but I have paid for a lot of ads. BookBub has done some stuff, good stuff for me, things like that. Yeah.
Okay, this question is for Liz and Barb, and Peg can jump in too. What contests have you entered, and how did you find them? Does it have to be the first year out for a book in order to enter it?
What was that last part? Does it have to be?
Does the book have to be in its first year to enter a contest? I think that's what the question
Well,
is.
so there's two there's contests for unpublished writers, and then contests for books that are published. So, Karen and Pam, are we still doing the Pikes Peak Writers Contest this year? So Pikes Peak Writers Contest will be back next year. I really recommend that one. It's phenomenal. And if you do place in that and then you go to Pikes Peak Writers Conference, it's much easier to walk up to an editor or an agent if you have that little tag that says you want a contest.
And I think every contest is different. They're going to have their own rules. So that's the thing, is you've got to read what the contest rules are. When did your book have to be published? Or for unpublished writers, it's different. And I bet you could Google contests, writing contests, and get a whole list of different places.
You can, but one caveat I would throw out there is if they charge a fee to go in, dip your toe in the water with caution. There are resources like Victoria Strauss, Writer Beware, that will list contests to avoid, as well as publishers to avoid, and lots of things to avoid. But there are still valid contests out there that charge money. Just be careful, because some of them are just out there to get your money. Another conference that has a contest is Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers up in Denver.
Colorado Gold.
They do their Colorado Gold contest. As for ones that I've entered, besides Writers of the Future and Colorado Book Award, I put my books in for World Fantasy Award because authors are allowed to submit their own, or a publisher can submit it for me. There are awards like Hugo Awards and Nebulas and things, but you have to, for those, you just have to get your name out there and hope that people like your work. What else was I going to say? Maybe that was it.
It was very good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I still have 3 cards here I didn't get to, but please feel free to come over and talk to our authors during one of the breaks, because I know they'd love to chat with you. One last question for y'all. We have just a couple minutes left. And this is the philosophy question. I don't know. Should I start with Peg?
Why not?
Let's make Peg do it.
I'm not picking on you, hon. So, to end this conversation, do you have a golden nugget of advice for someone who is a writer who's trying to make a go of it? So we're all in different places of where we write. Some of us have been writing for a while. Some of us are just starting out. There's struggles at each stage of the journey. What do you got?
Don't quit. As long as you don't quit, as long as you keep writing, you're not going to fail. So just don't quit.
Thank you. Liz?
I would say write what you love. Don't chase markets. Don't go, thrillers are the big thing this year, so I'll write a thriller. Write what you love to read, what you would love as a reader.
Yeah, those are exactly the things I would say. And I would also say, don't ever rest on your laurels. Keep working to get better.
Trust the process, because the process can really suck from time to time. And you're bored with everything that's going on. You think, I can never write another book again. I can't beat the one I just won the award for, so why bother? Trust the process.
Thank you so much. Let's give it up for our panelists, folks.